Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Oasis Focus and Finance Show. I'm your host Shafiq Morton. It's always good to be with you. In today's show we're going to have a look at the scenario of planning while you are engaged, planning for your life, planning for your marriage financially. Obviously, as spring goes into summer, if you are in that position, it's menus, venues, it's dates, it's all sorts of things going across your mind. And all families are involved in this family politics as well. But surely it's important to plan for your financial future. To help us through this and to ask and answer some of the crucial questions are Ebrahim Rawoot and Jehan Ebrahim. Ebrahim, assalamu alaikum, and of course assalamu alaikum to Jehan as well.
Wa alaikum salam, Shafiq, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Ebrahim, the first question, it's a simple question. Why is it necessary to start planning while we're engaged?
Now, when it comes to engaged couples, financial planning is probably twice as important because now it involves two people at the end of the day. And as many couples who are married, and you would obviously, be witness to that, is, it does involve a great deal of, planning. It does involve, a great deal of teamwork, and collectively together, those two individuals really makes this plan so effective. In addition, it may require a great amount of effort, in order to ensure that this plan now becomes viable. It's not only about, the venues and all those other, factors that comes into account, but really something that's going to ensure that, it becomes a benefit to both parties over the long term. So one essential aspect, that we really need to be able to agree upon is, whether those two parties are actually going to start pooling their resources together. And let's assume that both parties are working, both parties are qualified, so there's this income that's coming in. So the question now is whether we actually treat this income jointly, or whether we say, mine is mine and hers is hers. Then secondly, what we need to understand is, how are we going to be settling those expenses? So it becomes difficult if one party is earning a higher income than the other, but collectively they decide we're going to share the expenses equally. That can, become a little bit unfair to the party that is actually earning a lower income. Then there might be, a situation where we are going to jointly pool our resources together, but the one party decides to do that impulsive, extravagant purchases. And it can then become unfair on the other party that is, quite conservative. So, it is becoming very important that, from a financial point of view, that, we openly decide how we are going to start tackling these type of expenses. So Shafiq, really a useful way to start, this whole discussion is around, let's start off, the wedding is now coming, how are we going to tackle the wedding expenses? You mentioned some of the things, there's catering, there's venue costs, there's the wedding gown and all those other things.
The entourage and so on and so on.
Certainly. And weddings today generally have become a lot more expensive, and they've become, quite daunting in terms of, the bills that needs to be paid. So before that wedding day, we really want to have a plan in place that says we've already managed to, budget for all these type of expenses. And if we don't do this, come the day of the wedding and you still have a huge bill that is still sitting on your lap, it does affect all the other things post the wedding, whether it is, we now can't go on honeymoon. And, we want to make sure these things are, taken care of. So we really need to start off by, saying to ourselves, there is a wedding coming up. We need to have this budget in place. We need to know how we're going to handle all these expenses and, what we can afford to pay for today before the wedding. And if we can't and we're carrying certain expenses outside, beyond the wedding date, how are we going to manage to tackle those expenses as quickly as possible and not impact us and be a detriment to us longer down the line.
Jehan, over to you. Obviously, after the honeymoon, after the wedding, finances can become a very prickly issue within a marriage. So obviously, when one's engaged, it's a good time to start talking about it. But it does bring up the question of awkward questions. Jehan, how does one deal with a specific scenario?
Assalamu alaikum, Shafiq. Sharing your finances with someone, even if that someone is going to become your significant other, can be quite daunting. But it is a step towards building trust with each other And there are 3 key conversations you need to sit down and have with your future partner. I know that as an engaged couple, you may be caught up in the hype of the marriage and planning for it, but it is important you make time to talk to one another, as it does help you once you are married. The first conversation is about how your partner thinks about money, spending, and saving. Views about money are shaped by a number of factors, and people's values often play a role on how they see and treat their finances. It is important that before you enter a marriage, you understand exactly how your partner may view their finances. You will find that it may be a different view from your own, but don't judge your partner. This is a time for open conversation and understanding. The key is to start working together, which is what marriage is about, a firm partnership of trust and respect. So start the conversation by asking simple questions like, what do you think about creating an emergency fund? Do you budget your savings? What's the last really expensive thing you bought on impulse? How often do you impulse shop? How important are name brands to you? Do you spend lots of money on things you could find for cheaper prices? Have you started saving for retirement? Do you borrow money from others? How do you feel about being in debt? Remember, this is an open conversation. Don't judge your partner, no matter what answers they give you. They need to know it is a safe space for them to have this conversation. The second conversation is about your earnings. Many people don't reveal their income and keep it to themselves. But when you are entering a partnership like marriage, it is important you have this discussion, as it impacts your financial position as a couple down the line. Your annual household income will determine where and how you live, how much you're able to save, and even your quality of life. You must be in a position where you understand that you're able to adequately support each other. The third conversation is about debt. This is usually a difficult discussion, but necessary. Like it or not, lots of people have debt. It could be from a student loan, a credit card you use a little too often, or bills that have accumulated over time. When you get married, you may become directly responsible for your spouse's debts, so you should know what you're getting yourself into. Ask your partner how much debt they have and if they have a plan for paying it off. It's also important to know your partner's credit score, as it may determine the interest rates you receive on large purchases such as your home. It may be uncomfortable to share your debt with your partner, but it is necessary if you're going to establish a plan about how you're going to tackle it. The important thing is to get out of debt quickly so that you can start accumulating long-term wealth together.
Jehan, thank you for that. And let's go back to you, Ebrahim. What about the specifics of how we plan for our financial future as an engaged couple?
Well, planning a wedding, I think there are many aspects that we need to take into account. There's many aspects that we need to give due consideration to, and we can really get caught up in the detail of all it, and we fail to realize that there's a lot of basics that we could have taken care of a lot quicker and a lot easily. Really, once we've exchanged our vows, many couples now get down to the reality of the wedding, or at least the reality of the marriage. And that on its own, now requires detailed planning as well. It also involves a huge amount of organization, but, both parties now need to sit together. So a very good way to try and do this is, to build that plan and say, well, this is how we're now going to work on it. But there's 2 aspects that we need to take into account in this whole planning phase. There's creating joint goals, and there's also, creating joint financial planning. So here we now need to sit down. There's 2 individuals. So both individuals needs to make a list of their short-term and long-term goals. Collectively together, then say, what is our collective long-term and short-term goals? Sit down, look at what are the similarities, and then put a plan in place. And then, no matter who takes responsibility for these tasks, we should collectively as a couple work towards our strengths. Don't look at the negatives. There's many positives that we can work around. Then, so while preparing for your wedding, Shafiq, it's also very important that we start making a list of our assets, start making a list of our liabilities. I'm assuming many of us would have worked for a number of years. We might have accumulated a few assets in between. Those are assets that we now take with us into our wedding. We might have accumulated a certain amount of debt. We take that debt into our wedding. So as couples, we now need to sit down and say, but this is what I am bringing to the table. Assets and both liabilities. And many of us now have entered into different types of marriage contracts. Shafiq, it's not only about just love at the end of the day. We now start taking the legal positioning, and that is whether I get married in community of property, whether I do it via anti-nuptial contract, and then you can even do it with accrual, even without accrual. They're all very important. They all have very distinct differences. But again, how do we incorporate that to ensure that I am now putting this responsibility into the marriage itself? So if I'm getting married in community of property and there's debt that's coming into the equation, the other couple needs to know about that. But it's a wonderful exercise that really allows both partners to be able to understand we are getting married, but we're also bringing certain responsibilities and obligations to the table.
Jehan, over to you now. We've discussed some of the aspects, but can you be more specific? What sort of pointers would you be able to offer to a couple who are about to get married in terms of financial planning?
Shafiq, it's firstly worth noting that if you think you're too young to discuss the need to establish a financial plan with your partner, remember, the future is just around the corner and it's never too early. In order to make it through kids, houses, retirement, and into your golden years together with minimum financial concern, you need to have an effective financial plan in place. Such a plan would usually start with a budget, which could be treated as something that is relatively preliminary. Once you have worked out your budget, you would then be able to establish whether or not you're going to be able to afford a lavish wedding or an extravagant honeymoon. In addition, if either of you has a certain amount of debt that may be as a result of student loans or installments on a car, you then need to clearly establish how you're going to repay this debt and over what period. If one of you were to become financially bankrupt shortly after starting your married life, you would be placing immeasurable strain on your relationship. So once again, be sure to have a carefully considered financial plan in place before you exchange your sacred vows.
Jehan, if a couple is struggling to make a plan, what sort of advice could you give in that particular scenario, that particular situation?
Shafiq, one option that is available to engaged couples is to consult a certified financial planner who would be able to provide direction to the financial planning process. Your advisor will ask you questions that may affect your financial goals, like how many kids you'd like to have, where you'd want them to attend school, where you'd want to live, and when and in what style you want to retire. The financial planner will then be able to draw up a plan that provides you with a suggested course of action that will help you to reach your respective goals and the various compromises you may need to make, such as postponing retirement, deferring a vacation, or sending your kids to public schools. Remember that the objective of the financial planner will be to get you and your partner to agree on your common goals and what the two of you can afford in terms of your budget. During these engagements, don't be surprised if one of you is much more willing to take the lead when discussing financial matters. It's a fairly common phenomenon, the result of each partner's past family or personal experiences. In addition, if one party is reluctant, it may be fear as a result of the fact that they don't want to expose that they have excessive debt or a bad credit score. It's human nature to want to avoid mentioning these things, but as these things always show up sooner or later, you should disclose them sooner rather than later so that you can start doing something about them. Once you have a plan, you should check in regularly with each other and with your planner to see how you're doing. You will then also have an opportunity to ask follow-up questions and perhaps do some tweaking on your savings plans. In addition, it's always a good idea to consult with your financial planner once you have experienced a life-changing event, such as the purchase of a house or the birth of a child. These aspects will affect your financial plan and should be accommodated as carefully considered plans need to evolve over time. These aspects will affect your financial plan and should be accommodated as carefully considered plans need to evolve over time.
Okay, Ebrahim, now that we've got a basic framework, the skeleton as it were, you are a financial advisor. Where do we go from there? What advice do you give now?
Well, Shafiq, generally when we are young, the last thing on our mind is really investments and savings, because we believe it's something that's only going to materialize 25, 35 years from now. So, it's really the last thing from our mind. But what we fail to realize is that, the sooner we start, the earlier we start, the better the end result is always going to be. And we always speak about that concept of compounding, the time value of money and, what wealth it really creates for us over the years. So really, as financial advisors, we always want to introduce to people at a very young age to start that savings contribution. But then at the same time, remember, as a individual, just before you're married, you're qualified, you're earning an income, but you're living with your parents. So your savings ratio is quite substantial, and we need to be realistic to the fact that, the day you now get married, there's other responsibilities, whether it is paying towards a bond, whether it is paying rates, water, electricity. So we were insulated and protected from this before we got married because our parents used to take that responsibility. We now taking that responsibility ourselves. So yes, while your savings ratio now comes down, we still need to ensure and have a mindset that we're going to continue saving. Then, as financial advisors, we also encourage people to save for that, event that we're not really financially planning for, those unexpected expenditure that always comes in. And then we do know that there are certain, objectives that we want to achieve, whether it is, buying your own property. So we need to save towards that, whether it is performing pilgrimage sometime in the future, we need to prepare for that. So those are things that we need to ensure that individuals at a very young age are doing in order to ensure that that objective is going to be achieved. And then very importantly, something that we fail to realize is that, we need to also ensure that there's a last will and testament in place. We're now married, we have the responsibility of looking after our spouse, but the last thing we want is when we close our eyes that spouse does not know anything about the financial affairs, that spouse is waiting for the money to come through, but we never had a will in place and now we don't know how the assets need to be distributed. Or unfortunately, the distribution of that asset now is delayed because certain paperwork is not in place. So, it's a very holistic overview, but, it's so simple and yet so important in order to implement.
Can you just summarize some of the important financial aspects in terms of an engaged couple planning for their financial future?
To enjoy a happy and a long-lasting union, couples really need to plan carefully. And, there's a few very important points that I thought, we could summarize to ensure that, this is going to be achieved. So, really, you list your personal and financial goals, talk frankly about, financial values, disclose all your assets, but most importantly, also disclose all your liabilities. It's no use you going into a relationship, but you're hiding the debt at the end of the day. Formulate a financial plan for savings and for future expenditure. Try to decide upon each partner's role in your shared finances. So who's going to take care of what during that relationship? Monitor income and expenditure. If there's increases in salaries, factor that into the budget as well. And then also very importantly, we are knowledgeable ourselves, but we might be limited on certain areas. So seek professional advice when necessary and admit to yourself, I need that financial advice or I need that information. I'm going to go to the experts in those fields. Only take reasonable risk, don't take unnecessary risk because you believe you want to make quick money at the end of the day. And then, create wills and trust. So, really, Shafiq, it's about listing your personal assets and your personal liabilities. It's about listing your financial goals, what you want to achieve. This is a relationship that you now taking to the next level. It's a union of two people. Yes, there's a lot of, thought that went into it, but there's a lot more that needs to be thought of in terms of, the financial positioning. Many a time, we get caught up in the hype of all this and we realize that, we've now need to take an extra bond out or extra loan just to settle the expenses, or we rely on, financial aid and support from the family. So really we should be putting these budgets in place, we should be putting planning in place in order to ensure that, the wedding, which is the first objective, is achieved, and then settling the expenses as quickly as possible. And first prize is to make sure that the day of your nikah, you are in no debt. But many of us are obviously not in that position. So once we go into that debt position post the nikah date, we now work towards a plan to get rid of it, and then start saving early and ensure as a union couple that we work towards those objectives and goals.
And thanks to Ebrahim Rawoot and Jehan Ebrahim. Thank you.
Thank you, Shafiq.
And that concludes this edition of the Oasis Focus on Finance show. A special thanks to our guests Jehan Ebrahim and Ebrahim Rawoot. Should you wish to watch this or any of our other shows, you can log into the Oasis Crescent YouTube channel. Should you wish to contact us, you can dial 0860 100 786 or email info@oasiscrescent.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Shafiq Morton. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.